When I look back at New York in the year 1741, what strikes me most is not just the city itself, but the tension that quietly shaped everyday life. At the time, New York was still a relatively small colonial town. The entire population of New York County was only about 10,664 people. Yet within that population lived a large community of people of African ancestry. Historians estimate that roughly 16% of the residents were black, including both enslaved individuals and a smaller number of free black people. That meant people from very different worlds lived side by side in the narrow streets of colonial New York. Enslaved laborers worked in homes, docks, warehouses, and taverns. Free black residents tried to build lives within a system that placed constant limits on their freedom. White merchants, craftsmen, and officials depended on this labor, but also feared it. The proximity of these communities created a fragile balance that colonial leaders constantly worried could break. That fear did not come from imagination alone. Only a few decades earlier, in 1712, the city had experienced a violent uprising by enslaved Africans. During that rebellion, several rebels set fire to a building and attacked colonists who rushed to the scene. 9 colonists were killed. The colonial authorities responded with extreme punishment. 21 people were eventually executed after being convicted of what the law called petty treason. The memory of that event stayed alive in the minds of officials and residents for decades. By the early 1740s, the colony was already living with deep anxiety. The winter of 1740 and 1741 was remembered as one of the harshest in the colonial period. The Hudson River remained frozen far longer than usual, and the cold placed enormous pressure on the poorest residents of the city. Food was scarce, work was uncertain, and frustration toward the authorities grew stronger. At the same time, the British Empire was at war with Spain, in what became known as King George's War. News of conflict overseas and the possibility of foreign attacks only deepened the sense of insecurity inside the colony. Officials feared that enemies of Britain might try to stir unrest among enslaved populations in colonial cities. So, by the beginning of 1741, New York was already a city living with suspicion and unease. Economic hardship, memories of past rebellion, and fears of war created a fragile atmosphere. In a place where trust was already thin, it would not take much to ignite panic. And very soon, a series of events would push that fear to a level few people in the city had ever imagined. With all of that tension already hanging over the city, the events of the spring of 1741 unfolded in a way that must have felt deeply unsettling to the people who lived there. When I read the records from that time, it becomes clear that many residents were already expecting trouble. What they did not expect was how quickly fear would spread once the first disaster struck. On March 18, 1741, a major fire broke out at Fort George. The fort stood at the southern end of Manhattan and served as the residence of the colonial governor, George Clark. It was one of the most important buildings in the colony. When the flames destroyed large portions of the structure, the event immediately caught the attention of the entire town. Fires were not uncommon in wooden colonial cities, but the destruction of such an important building raised serious questions. At first, many people believed the fire might have been an accident. Colonial cities often faced this danger because buildings were constructed closely together and heating fires were common during cold weather. But the situation soon became more alarming. In the days and weeks that followed, additional fires began appearing across the lower part of Manhattan. Historical records suggest that at least 13 more fires occurred during that tense period. Some were small and quickly contained, while others caused significant damage. To modern readers, it might sound like a coincidence, but to the residents of New York in 1741, these fires seemed connected. Each new blaze strengthened the belief that something deliberate might be happening. One particular moment intensified the fear dramatically. During one warehouse fire, an enslaved man named Cuffy was reportedly seen leaving the area. When he was captured and questioned, rumors spread rapidly through the streets. People began shouting that the enslaved population was rising against the city. The cry that echoed through the crowd was simple and terrifying. "The Negroes are rising. In a community already shaped by memories of the 1712 rebellion, those words carried enormous weight. Panic moved faster than facts. Authorities began arresting people quickly, often based on suspicion alone. Within a short time, nearly 100 individuals had been jailed. As I reflect on this moment, what stands out is how fragile the situation had become. A series of fires combined with an atmosphere of distrust was enough to push the entire city toward collective panic. And this was only the beginning. The investigations that followed would take the crisis into far darker territory. As the arrests continued and the jails of New York began to fill, the colonial authorities faced a growing problem. The fires had created fear, but fear alone could not explain what had happened. Officials wanted a clear story, something that would prove the city was facing a coordinated conspiracy. This was the moment when the investigation moved to the center of the crisis. One of the most important figures in this process was Daniel Horsmanden. He served as the city recorder and was also a justice of the New York Supreme Court. Horsmanden took a leading role in questioning suspects and organizing the legal response. When I read the surviving records, it is clear that he believed strongly that a large conspiracy existed. His investigation became increasingly aggressive as he tried to uncover what he believed was a hidden plan against the city. The problem was that solid evidence was difficult to find. Most of the early arrests had been made in the middle of panic, and many prisoners denied any involvement in the fires. The authorities needed testimony that could connect the events together into a single explanation. That testimony eventually came from an unexpected place. A young Irish indentured servant named Mary Burton became the central witness in the case. Burton was only 16 years old and worked for a tavern keeper named John Hewson. She had originally been questioned during an investigation into a theft involving several enslaved men. At first, her statements focused only on that small crime. But the pressure placed on Burton quickly increased. She was held by the authorities and warned that she might face imprisonment if she refused to cooperate. At the same time, she was offered a powerful incentive. Officials promised her £100 and her freedom if she provided information that helped expose the alleged conspiracy. Under those circumstances, her testimony began to grow far more dramatic. Burton told investigators that meetings had taken place in Hewson's tavern, where enslaved men and other suspects had discussed plans to burn the city. According to her account, the conspirators intended to destroy buildings, kill white residents, and eventually place a new ruler over the colony. To the frightened officials of New York, this story seemed to confirm their worst fears. It appeared to explain the fires and justified the growing wave of arrests. Yet even at the time, some observers questioned how reliable such testimony could be when it came from a teenager under intense pressure and promised a life-changing reward. Looking back today, this moment feels like a turning point in the entire episode. Mary Burton's statements gave the investigation a narrative that authorities were eager to believe. From that point forward, the crisis no longer centered only on unexplained fires. It had become a story of an alleged conspiracy. And that story would soon drive the courts toward a series of trials that shocked the city. As Mary Burton's testimony spread through the investigation, the authorities of New York believed they finally had the explanation they had been searching for. The fires were no longer treated as isolated incidents. Instead, officials became convinced that the city was facing a dangerous conspiracy. Once that idea took hold, the legal system began moving very quickly. The trials that followed took place in an atmosphere filled with fear and anger. From the perspective of modern readers, it is difficult not to notice how fragile the legal process had become. Many of the accused were enslaved people who had very little protection under colonial law. Even more troubling, none of the lawyers in New York stepped forward to defend them in court. As a result, the defendants were forced to stand before the judges and attempt to defend themselves. When I think about this moment in history, it is hard not to feel a sense of unease. Imagine standing in a courtroom surrounded by hostile witnesses and frightened officials, while trying to argue your innocence without any legal help. That was the reality many of the accused faced during the summer of 1741. The evidence presented in court often relied heavily on testimony from other prisoners. Some statements had been given under pressure. Others directly contradicted earlier accounts. Yet in the tense climate of the city, those contradictions rarely slowed the trials. Each confession or accusation seemed to reinforce the belief that a larger conspiracy existed. Convictions soon began to follow. Several of the accused men were sentenced to death by hanging, one of the most common methods of execution in the British colonies. Public executions were intended to send a message to the community. Crowds gathered as the condemned were brought to the gallows. In some cases, the bodies of the executed were left on display in chains after death. The intention was clear. Officials wanted the punishment to serve as a warning to others. In other cases, the punishment was even more severe. A number of men convicted of arson were sentenced to death by burning. This method, though rare in most English courts, was used in the colony as a demonstration of authority and control. The spectacle was meant to satisfy a public that believed the city had narrowly escaped destruction. As I read these accounts today, what stands out most is the speed with which fear shaped the legal system. The trials did not simply judge individuals, they reflected the panic of an entire community that believed it was defending itself from danger. Yet the story was far from over. The accusations would soon spread even further, pulling more people into the investigation and pushing the crisis to an even more unsettling stage. As the trials continued through the summer of 1741, the atmosphere inside New York changed in a profound way. What had begun as a response to a series of fires was turning into something much larger and far more troubling. The investigation no longer focused on a small number of suspects. Instead, suspicion began spreading through the city itself. When historians look back at this moment, many draw comparisons to the Salem witch trials of 1692. In both cases, a fearful community began searching desperately for hidden enemies. Each new accusation seemed to confirm the belief that a dangerous plot existed. As a result, the circle of suspicion widened again and again. In New York, the accusations increasingly focused on people who already lived on the margins of colonial society. Enslaved black residents were the first and most frequent targets. Their daily presence in homes, warehouses, and taverns had long made many white colonists uneasy. Once the idea of a conspiracy took hold, that unease easily turned into suspicion. The investigation soon expanded beyond the enslaved population. Authorities began looking closely at black sailors who had been captured from Spanish ships during the ongoing war between Britain and Spain. These men were sometimes referred to in colonial records as Spanish Negroes. Some of them insisted that they were free citizens who had served aboard Spanish vessels. Despite those claims, they were treated as enslaved people by the courts because of their skin color and their uncertain legal status. Religious fear also entered the picture. England had a long history of suspicion toward Catholicism, and during wartime, those fears could easily intensify. Rumors began circulating that Catholic agents might be secretly working to weaken British colonies. Within that climate of distrust, a man named John Urry came under investigation. Urry was a teacher of Latin who had recently arrived in the colony. Authorities suspected that he might actually be a Catholic priest operating in secret. During his trial, he firmly denied the accusation and insisted that he was innocent. According to the records, he spoke calmly and appealed to God during his final moments. Despite those statements, the court found him guilty, and he was executed in August of 1741. Looking back at these events today, what stands out is how quickly suspicion spread once the city accepted the idea of a hidden conspiracy. The search for enemies expanded beyond the original fires and began to include people from different backgrounds and communities. By this point, the investigation had grown so large that the jails were overflowing with prisoners. Accusations were multiplying faster than the courts could handle them, and slowly, even the officials who had driven the investigation forward began to realize that the situation was becoming impossible to control. By the time the investigations finally began to slow in late 1741, the damage done to the people of New York was already immense. What had started with a few mysterious fires had grown into one of the most tragic legal episodes in the history of colonial America. When we step back and look at the numbers recorded by historians, the scale of the human cost becomes painfully clear. In total, 161 black residents and 20 white residents were arrested during the panic. Many of these people had little ability to defend themselves within the colonial legal system, Their lives were swept into a wave of accusations that spread faster than evidence. The punishments that followed were severe. 30 black men were executed, 17 were hanged, and 13 were burned to death after being convicted of arson or conspiracy. 4 white individuals were also executed by hanging. Beyond those executions, many others faced a different fate. 84 people were sold and transported to the Caribbean, where they were forced into slavery under extremely harsh conditions. When I read these numbers today, it is difficult not to pause and reflect on how quickly fear can reshape a society. Behind every number was a human life. Families were broken apart, communities were scarred, and the memory of these events lingered long after the trials ended. Modern historians have spent many years examining the surviving documents from 1741, including the detailed account written by Daniel Horsmanden himself. What many scholars now agree on is that the evidence for a large organized slave conspiracy is extremely weak. Instead, historians often describe the events as the result of mass fear, racial prejudice, and a legal system that failed to protect the most vulnerable people in the colony. In other words, the conspiracy that terrified New York may never have existed in the form that officials imagined. What did exist was a powerful combination of suspicion, social tension, and political pressure that pushed the courts toward tragic decisions. For me, looking back at the story of 1741 is deeply unsettling, but also important. It reminds us that justice can be fragile when fear dominates public life. The events of that year left a lasting mark on the history of New York and on the broader story of race and power in colonial America. Understanding that history allows us to see how easily societies can lose their balance and how important it is to question fear before it becomes judgment. For me, the story of New York in 1741 is deeply unsettling because it shows how quickly fear can overwhelm justice. When a society begins to see enemies everywhere, the law itself can become a tool of injustice. Learning about this moment changed the way I think about power and responsibility. I would truly love to hear what you think about this history. Share your thoughts in the comments, and please subscribe to When History Broke so we can keep exploring the past together.